And we are back, officially discussing the situation in Ukraine. I am joined, as always, by a special guest. How are you guys doing today?
I'm doing pretty fine.
Doing great. Glad to be here.
Likewise, thank you for inviting me.
My pleasure. And so we will in this stream we will be giving an update from the last stream, which we did on the Ukraine war. In that last stream, I discussed the movement of the Russian troops was mainly in the Kiev area and also in the Sumy Oblast, and that changed since that last stream, to where that area has been completely evacuated, as I will show in my PowerPoint in just a minute. But that area has been evacuated, and in exchange, the Russians have decided to focus on the south and eastern front and prioritize the Donbass and Crimean areas. So that is what the major happenings have been going on. So let me bring up my PowerPoint, and we will get right into the stream. Should be an excellent discussion. So the withdrawal. So this is this current situation as it stands roughly right now. Obviously, isn't completely accurate, but file of war. So as you can see, the area in the north here has been completely withdrawn, and many people on Twitter were saying this was because the Russians were just losing so badly that they had to withdraw. And actually, if you think about it strategically, this is probably just a strategic withdrawal because this attack on the Kiev suburbs was only 30,000 men. And if you think about it, 30,000 men are not going to capture a city of 3.1 million, even if it is defended the best. So I don't buy that narrative of withdrawal because of defeat.
Yeah,
It's
I
more
think
likely it's just a repositioning of forces to the east, as we see in this graph.
yeah, I'd agree with that assessment. I just posted a link in the comments for any observers here. There's a good Substack article on the Russian withdrawal from the north and the northeast of the countries. Um, and basically, as far as I can tell, it's um, a strategic necessity, right? It sucks for the Russians, obviously, because you don't want to give up ground that you've already previously captured and shed blood to take, right? But from their perspective, this, and indeed from what Vladimir Putin has said, this was always about the Donbass and always preventing the Ukraine from joining NATO. So if you can secure the Donbass and capture a little bit more territory that you didn't previously have in the east, and also prosecute the Ukrainian army in the east and continue encircling it, that is going to lead to a greater W than just letting your forces continuously be attrited by American provided anti-tank guided missiles.
Yeah, I would also agree. I basically think that the Russians are mainly going to focus on securing Donbass, which is what their original goal has been. And so once they secure Donbass, then we're going to see what they do from there. But I do think they've also been successful at basically weakening the Ukrainian military because although it might seem as though Russia is losing, Ukraine has also suffered a significant amount of losses. And I do think that was also Russia's goal was besides securing Donbass, I think they also wanted to weaken Ukraine's military as a whole.
Another thing that kind of needs to be taken into account when analyzing this map is that the lion's share, the majority of the Ukrainian army, is pretty much located all around these red and purple and pink spots on the map. Other than Mandra, we talked about how most of Ukraine's armored forces was around Kharkiv. Was that confirmed, or was that just a speculation on our part?
I think that was just a speculation on our part, and I made that assessment and assumption because it took the Russians a long time to make any sort of progress around that area, and also because given the dispositions of the Russian armor, that's kind of where I would have expected the Ukrainians to have deployed it, right? Because if you're the Ukrainians and you see the Russians coming just to the north of Sumy with their armored tank armies, that's where I would have deployed my tank units in order to counterattack those. So that's just what I thought was going to happen.
Yeah, and so the reason I asked that is because I think one of the major reasons we haven't seen massive Russian success is the fact that Russia has been kind of deliberately avoiding destroying the Ukrainian army in detail. And, to avoid kind of repeating what the other speakers on this panel have said, I mean, I really do think this is a consolidation of Russian military units into the Donbass in order to encircle and actually commit its forces to destroying the conventional Ukrainian army, so that there's no real conventional forces left officially within the country, and that's a much stronger position to move into negotiations with. So that's just my speculation.
Yeah, it's also, I mean, the story of the first 2 weeks, right, was watching a whole bunch of isolated T-72s and a bunch of like BMPs and Russian IFVs rolling around in Ukraine and getting picked off by UAVs and by various sorts of anti-tank weapons, infantry held anti-tank weapons in urban areas. So I mean, this whole like idea that they could have just rolled in without taking any of the urban territory kind of obviously has fallen apart. I think that was a like mistaken assumption, which was ultimately based on the misreading of how the Ukrainians would respond and whether or not they would fight. I think that the Russian high command did not believe that the Ukrainians would have put up much of a fight. And so obviously you see them sending out isolated units and getting picked off.
Also, we see with that area in the north that was formerly being attacked here, the supply lines here are ridiculously long and complicated. And as we know, Ukraine is a very large country, the second largest compared to Russia and Europe. And that's just the European side of Russia. And so the Germans also experienced this in World War II, where when you have long supply lines, it doesn't go very well because, again, those can be attacked fairly easily with isolated units and convoys with those missiles, because, again, a lot of these convoys were just tanks and supply trucks, not a lot of air assets to protect them.
Right, and mechanized infantry especially.
So that's probably the main reason why this front was abandoned. And strategically, it was probably a better decision, although it looks bad. But the strategic wins out in the end.
Right. I honestly, I still maintain that if the Russians had actually thought about this and advanced their tank corps down from Sumy and advanced to the Dnieper, basically, and just cut off the Ukrainian forces from the Dnieper, that would have been like a better plan than what they did in the initial 2 weeks. But that's just what I would have do if General Mandrel was around.
Yeah, that probably would have been better considering the chaotic first weeks of this war.
Yeah.
And so next we have the West responding once again by virtue signaling about how great and virtuous they are by sending Ukraine all of these great tanks. They're great value. They're going to make a really big difference. These T-72s, which Russia's already destroyed, I think, 50 of already. And those were the Czech tanks, which arrived much earlier than these. These are the latest figures I have on this.
Yeah, I just, for everybody in the chat, linked a bunch of articles for everybody. There's a couple good Substack articles. I think our buddy Charlemagne wrote one on Russia's strategic goals, and there's another one in the chat as well on Russia's pullout from the north and northeast. There's another one as well that I found this week. It's a South African source. It's the first one, Oryx. And that is very good at explaining precisely the types and the numbers of heavy equipment that is being given to Ukraine from all sources. So if you'd like, America Populist, I can just give us a brief rundown as we all look at it. I mean, obviously, you've got the Polish and Czech contributions as well up from the Visegrad group. So
yeah, sure, go ahead.
There's a lot to go through here. So the I'll just go through stuff that we have numbers for here, not anything that's like to be delivered, right? So the U.S. has obviously committed quite a substantial amount of aid in the hundreds of billions. I think the Congress passed a $700 million aid package recently. So they've received more than 16 Bayraktar unmanned drones from Turkey. The U.S. is going and planning to be giving, and Britain as well, are planning to be giving a lot of loitering munitions that will number in various type, but they will number in the hundreds or to the thousands, supposedly. The Ukrainians are going to also be receiving other sort of reconnaissance UAVs. The Czechs and other Eastern European countries are giving various surface-to-air missile systems. Basically, the story of this is that all of the old Eastern European countries that used to be part of the Soviet bloc are giving old Soviet kit to the Ukrainians, and that's the story. In addition to what the West is already giving or planning to be giving, like for example, according to this, the Poles have given the Ukrainians a bunch of R-73 missiles to the tune of about 100 of them. However, the Ukrainians don't really have any aircraft to use those, because those are all air-to-air missiles, short-range air-to-air missiles of the old Soviet type. So from that perspective, this is where you kind of remember the West was talking about, hey, we're gonna get all of these MiGs from the Eastern European countries and just ship them over to Ukraine. This is why they were doing that, right? Because Poland had already committed these missiles to Ukraine in February. So there's a bunch of radars that they're getting from all various types. I think it looks like the Netherlands, the United States, as well as Australia is giving stuff. Like you see on the screen right now on the Visegrad group, the Czechs and the Poles are giving hundreds of T-72s. On this Oryx source, it says that the Czechs are giving about a dozen plus, and the Poles are giving about 100 plus. So that's quite a lot. In terms of infantry fighting vehicles, it's the Czechs are giving 5 plus BVP-1s, 56 PBV 501 alphas, which these are various old Soviet types of IFEs. Poland's also going to give some of their old Soviet IFEs as well. In addition, the United States is going to be giving a lot of its old Vietnam-era M113 APCs, and they've committed to giving them 200. In addition, for the British are weird because they've said that they're giving 120 AFVs of various types, and included in that is the F-103 FV-103 Spartans, the Mastiff MRAP, the Wolfhound Heavy Tactical Support Vehicle, the Husky Tactical Support Vehicle. But they're only giving a batch of about 120 of all various types. Australia has also committed to giving 20 MRAPs as well of their Bushmaster types. The United States has committed to giving them about 100 plus Humvees. Let's see here. Now we get on to the towed artillery and self-propelled artillery and rocket launchers. So I think Estonia is giving 9 122 millimeter D-30 howitzers. That's an old Soviet artillery piece. The Czechs are giving towed artillery as well. The United States have committed to giving 18 155 millimeter howitzers. That says here that those are believed to be the M198 type. Britain has also committed to giving long-range artillery, but it doesn't say what caliber or what type it is. The Czechs and the Poles are giving about 20 each of artillery. So it says here that the Czechs are giving 20 plus 152 millimeter SHKH VZ-77 Dana. So that's old Soviet propelled artillery. The Poles are giving 20 plus 122 millimeters 2S1 Gozjik. And obviously they're also giving about 20 plus a piece, both Czechia and Poland, of old Soviet type multiple rocket launchers. So this is all the kind of heavy equipment that the Ukrainians don't have or are being attrited and that they desperately need.
Also, something not mentioned here is the wear on some of these. I heard stories about some of these Czech tanks being not exactly in the best condition because a lot of these are in storage, so not exactly going to be the most useful.
So,
well, it's better than nothing, right?
So what it seems is that they're mainly supplying them with old Soviet weaponry. Is that correct?
Yes, and
For the
from
heavy
what
systems, yes.
yes, and from what I can tell, everything that's not being supplied from the West is being supplied from all of the old Soviet bloc countries that are now NATO aligned.
Yeah.
So all of this old, what I perceive here, right, is that this is going to be kind of an under the table deal where all of these countries that used to be Soviet bloc and now are in NATO are going to start siphoning off all this old Soviet kick that's in storage, and they'll be able to use this as a bargaining chip to purchase Western weapons, right? So that's how I see this going down.
Definitely, that's a very likely scenario, especially because I already heard the Czechs are looking to buy lots of that sweet, sweet American weaponry from Lockheed Martin and Boeing already. So that prediction is looking very accurate, I will say.
This
So
whole
I'll just bring
thing,
up this
all of this
sorry, go ahead.
just seems like a yeah, like y'all have already pointed out, all this just seems to be one big old fucking operation. Like everyone, I think even the West kind of knows that there's no possible way that this can go on forever. And I think that at least in the halls of power, they've kind of come to the conclusion that, well, we can't beat Russia. We can't even stop them. So what we're going to do is we're just going to use this as a dumping ground for all of our old shit, like in a Hearts of Iron 4 game. We're going to use this as a dumping ground for all of our old shit and wait for Russia to kind of inevitably sort of creep its way forward, because Russia is pouring everything into this, and that's not going to stop, I don't believe. And, then and as soon as there's no way they can keep this from ending, but it's like, just to restate, it's like they want this to go on for as long as possible so they can dispose of a lot of, including, honestly, as Bat made in his recent show, any right wingers they can send over to die fighting for Azov or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, just look at the type of kit that's being sent over there. It's all old Vietnam era stuff, like the M113s, like that stuff that like the United States Army is planning on phasing out anyway, and has it's ridiculous, right? I'm not an expert on American howitzers or anything, but the fact that we're providing them with 155 millimeter howitzers, like, and 100 Humvees. I mean, how long have those things been in inventory?
Yeah.
Probably a really long time.
Also, another thing we need to think about is Russia took out all the oil refineries in Ukraine, so getting the fuel needed to supply those vehicles, even if they're in good condition, is already going to be much more difficult now.
Yeah.
So either way, it's going to be bad for them.
Yeah. On the plus side for the Ukrainians, the fact that they're getting weaponry that they probably already have spare parts in inventory and already have at least some experience in maintaining and supplying is really, really good for them, and at least in the short term. They have T-72s already in their inventory. They already have the ability to keep these things up and running, even if they're in our terrible condition. So at least that's good for them, I guess.
Yeah, that is an advantage. They were formerly a part of the Soviet Union, not Eastern Bloc countries, so they would probably have that expertise. So I'll just bring this up real quick because this was a big story last week, and we all knew this narrative was going to come because the media kept saying how Russia was going to commit war crimes by launching chemical weapons attacks, and suddenly it popped up. Yeah, and it already fell apart within a day. This narrative, Nazov guy, Mariupol, who's coughing. That's where this whole narrative came from, about chemical weapons. Which just shows you Western hubris in these journalists who just lie to you about everything. So let's just bring that up. And let's get to our favorite topic of the day. So the Moskva. So if you don't know, the Moskva, it was capital ship of the Russian Black Sea Fleet, and it was a big propaganda victory for the Ukrainians because they supposedly took it out with two Harpoon missiles a couple days ago. And my friend Mr. Mandro knows a lot about this, so I'm just going to let him take away with this.
All right, so correction, not Harpoon missiles. That's a United States weapons platform. No, this was made by the Neptune missile. This is a Ukrainian homebrew version of the old Soviet SSN-25 missile. So I'll just give everybody a brief rundown on what this is, right? This is a very basic active seeker, subsonic, medium to long range cruise missile, right? Every single country in the world that has a navy or has a naval presence is going to have a weapons system or a missile system that's similar in profile to that. So it's not uncommon by any means. In fact, like from profile perspective, like everybody's got one of these things. So also the Moskva itself, as I understand it, was the flagship of the Black Sea Fleet. So yes, this is a massive propaganda coup. The fact that they've sunk this thing.
Definitely, it was a major victory a propaganda victory for the Ukrainians, although it'll have no impact on the war itself.
Yeah.
As all the media are claiming how great a victory this is, and it's the most advanced ship ever sunk, even though the ship is a 50-year-old Soviet vessel.
And I'm sure Russia probably has ships that are like more newer than this. So
yes, as I understand, they already have a replacement planned, and they're building one right now. So this is not really like I've said before with all this ex-Soviet equipment, like Russia's already planning on replacing all of this stuff. So it's kind of like the West, right? With all of its like equipment that they're just dumping in Ukraine. Everybody has this old Soviet kit that they're trying desperately to get rid of. And obviously this Ukraine has just become a dumping ground for this stuff that's just obsolete. So I just linked an article in the chat from that Oryx source that I mentioned earlier. I'd like to go in relatively in depth on exactly how this thing sunk, right? Because normally a big ship like this does have defenses against missiles in terms of anti-air defenses, CIWS, radars that can detect sea skimming missiles and aircraft, and also missiles that can shoot it down. So how does this occur? Well, as AP mentioned before, this warship is nearly 50 years old. So it's relatively ancient. In addition, because it is so ancient, it has inherent vulnerabilities, and that has to do with how its radar system works, right? If you'll notice, on the aft portion of the portion of the aft deck house, right astern of the missile racks there that you can clearly see on the port side, that is a more traditional air search radar. So if you think about this, right, like every time you see in an old movie, right, when people look at a radar screen in like what is supposed to be the Combat Information Center on a warship, where you see like this like very clearly sweeping motion across a screen, right? That's because this radar operates like that. So it like sweeps all the way around 360 degrees and gets a contact from whatever's flying towards it, right? Whether that's an aircraft, whether that's a missile. This differs from more modern radars, which you have basically arrays of multiple types of radars that just have a sector that they're supposed to be able to detect, right? But of course, all the new warships, each sector like interlocks, so you have 360 degree coverage, right? Not the case for this kind of warship. So from the perspective of vulnerability, obviously, if you are like a radar that sweeps around 360 degrees, that's like 4, 5, 6 seconds. So if you imagine a missile coming in, even like subsonic, which is just below Mach 1, like that's still pretty quick. Like if people didn't know, Mach 1 is around like 600, 700 miles an hour, basically. So it's still moving pretty quick. So if you imagine this radar has to sweep all the way around, pick up this missile contact, the crew has to detect that, identify what it is, react to it, launch off whatever air defense missiles you're shooting at it. And, in the 4 seconds that thing comes around again, the missile could be in an entirely different place. These things are not slow moving. There's also an additional problem, right? As I've mentioned before on many streams, most of these like missiles that have like an active seeker are what's called sea skimming, right? So they kind of are like have this flight profile where they're relatively close to the ocean surface. Traditional air searched radars have a hard time detecting those things, right? This is why in the Falklands War, a lot of the Argentinians just put bombs on an F-4 and flew like right above the sea level in order to attack the British fleet in that conflict. Same thing, right? It's the same flight profile basically. So when you're talking about this missile, and you're having two missiles shot at this thing, and it's trying to detect two missiles being shot at it at once, obviously it suffers the inherent disadvantage of that, in addition to anything else. So from the perspective of the crew, it depends. I don't know how well trained the Russians are. I'm assuming that because this is a relatively old warship, that how can you possibly be well trained if your warship just simply isn't maintained enough because you don't have the spare parts or whatever to keep things up and running. So if you can't train the people who are supposed to be making the decisions to shoot down the incoming missile, well, it's kind of hard, right? So that's the crew aspect, right? And obviously the maintenance aspect of that. I think that given this warship's level of technology, there's also another aspect to this, right? Because it has this old style air search radar that's like, sweeping around every couple of seconds. The Russians decided in their ship design to have 6 close-in weapon system. This is like the Russian 1970s version of what we on our warships have as the phalanx, CIWS, the close-in weapon systems. They have 6 of these things on board, right? Whereas in American warships, they have like maybe 1 or 2. I can only assume that the Russians or the Soviets, when they designed this thing, knew that their air search radar was kind of subpar. So they decided to put on more CIWS weapons. However, obviously, all of these defenses that they have failed, and they got struck by 2 missiles. So that's my take on why exactly this thing got hit by 2 relatively basic missile systems.
Definitely, we need to keep in mind also with these ships, the Russian Navy has a history with fires on board their vessels. It's just something that happens. Not sure if it's poor quality or poor damage control training. Not sure. It could be a combination of both, or equipment failure, as Mr. Mandrill mentioned. This is an outdated vessel, so that is going to play a part. But also, crew training is a major component. It's how you can control damage, as we saw in World War II, where the Japanese carriers at the Battle of Midway suffered the most damage because the damage control crews were not well trained at all. So that's where most of the damages occur on these vessels, and fire is a very significant hazard.
I believe this incident also happened similarly to the Russo-Japanese War, because during that war, the Russian Navy seemed ill-prepared when it came to fighting against the Japanese.
Yes, it's also of note that in the Russo-Japanese War as well, the Japanese used high explosive shells and in order to inflict fires, right? I mean, if anybody who's ever played World of Warships has seen that game in operation, that high explosive shells in a video game, just to illustrate the point here, cause a lot of fire. Basically, it's important to remember that as well that most of the munitions from missiles, especially this particular profile of missile weapon, usually they have high explosive munitions as well. So that is another factor. Another thing to note is that, like, every single warship has fuel, has oil, has tons of munitions crammed onto it, and various like flammable materials that are just a class alpha material, right? Paper, lagging, things like that. So you're not far from any sort of explosive or flammable material on a warship. You're very close in any particular spot that you choose to reside in. So the fact that it caught on fire is not really outside of the norm for naval combat, nor is it really outside of the norm either that what the Russians are claiming supposedly happened for it to sink, which was that it got damaged, it caught on fire, they started to tow it back to port, and it sank in heavy seas along the way back. That's not unheard of either. There was a American battleship post Pearl Harbor that got sank and was refloated and taken back to San Diego, but didn't make it back to San Diego because it sank on the way there. So that sort of scenario isn't exactly unheard of in naval warfare.
In addition, it needs to be kind of emphasized that the strategic implications of the sinking of this vessel are kind of slim to none. This is not a naval war, and the sinking of this ship does not at all affect the fact that Russia has complete, total, and absolute naval superiority over the Black Sea currently. And, this warship is old. Like, this warship didn't really, it was kind of just taking up, it was kind of just displacing water, right? It didn't really serve any massive strategic purpose, right? And stuff like this will happen in warfare. Stuff like this when like every bad thing that could possibly happen to get rid of an asset will just happen and you'll lose an asset. Like, it is what it is. But the fact that this has been so inflated, this has been talked to death about how this is some massive like victory for the Ukrainians and the tide is turning, no pun intended. Not really. It's just a it's big. Yeah, it looks good, but at most this is like a propaganda victory for the Ukrainians, if it even is that. But the effects it has on the total war are just minimal, if anything.
Yeah, it's just basically a distraction of what's to come.
As far as I can convey, this ship has never fired or been engaged in combat in this war so far. As far as I could tell, the Russians were using it as a to monitor the skies and the coast of Odessa. As far as I can tell, is all it was being used for.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we don't exactly know how much or how many casualties the Russians suffered on this warship, right? I mean, I find it very difficult to believe that they took no casualties, considering that they took 2 missile hits and essentially an ammo detonation, which is kind of what the story that the Russians are saying, right? Oh, like no loss of casualties or whatever. I find that very difficult to believe for as much as happened to this vessel. It is not unheard of in naval warfare for ships to take hits and not take any significant personnel casualties. For example, there was a warship in the tanker war in the Persian Gulf in the 80s. It was, I can't remember the name of it. I think it was USS Stark, I believe. But it actually ran into a mine, and the mine, detonated next to the ship and cracked the ship's keel. But surprisingly, no one was killed, and I think very few people at all were injured. I think no one seriously. So, stranger things do happen in these conflicts. But I just kind of doubt that there were no casualties whatsoever.
Yeah, I find that narrative very hard to believe from the Russians. These ships tend to have a crew of 500, although it could be understaffed as the ship is fairly old, so it's hard to tell how staffed it was. Although it was serving as the flagship of the Black Sea Fleet, so it did have a captain on board.
Yeah, I will. Cringewalker's in the chat here, so I'll address his comment here if you don't mind. He says that old does not equal bad if it's well maintained. Well, Cringewalker, that's true to a point. Even like aging assets can serve some purpose, but it depends, right? Because once you start running low on spare parts, it just becomes extremely difficult to keep things running smoothly. Especially if you're talking about like, okay, I lost, this, part or this circuit card or this thingamajiggy, or that isn't made anymore, we can't make it anymore, or we have to like fabricate it ourselves and wait like 8 months for it to come back from the factory or whatever. So you're not wrong, but like for elderly warships like this, if I can put it mildly, like this is taking your grandma a couple hip replacements to war, basically. It's not that it can't do nothing, but it's just showing its age, right? It's just an old ship. And with the way that the sea has a tendency just to destroy every sort of metal component, right? Just corrosion is a huge problem. So there just comes a point where you can only weld so many new deck plates onto the thing. You can only do so much before it just becomes cost prohibitive, right? Maintenance is extremely expensive, and at some point you're just like sinking more money into an aging asset, or do I just build a new one? And the answer in naval terms is to always build a new one is better.
Which is what the Russians are doing anyway. The ship's replacement was already being built before it was sunk, and it was due to be scrapped actually in the late 90s, I believe, but the mayor of Moscow actually saved it, and so that's why it's actually named Moskva after Moscow, because he saved the ship from scrapping. Fascinating history with this ship, but it is just a piece of junk. So RWA's opinion about what's about to happen. I believe this war is about to heat up for 4 main reasons. Number one, the siege of Mariupol is almost over. We'll get into that. Strategic bombers of the Russian Aerospace Forces have reportedly been on Mariupol alert. The Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs has announced that NATO vehicles transporting weapons from Ukraine are considered legitimate military targets. And number 4, the Russian Ministry of Defense has threatened to bomb decision-making centers in Kiev, including Kiev if the Ukrainians fire at Russian territory again. And so what we have here is him just laying out what we talked about earlier with repositioning of the Russian forces from the Sumy and Kiev Oblast to the east and south. So that he was right there, of course. And the siege of Mariupol is basically over at this point. The Russians control 98% of the city. The only resistance to the Russians is the Azov-style steelworks, which the Russians just tried to persuade the people to surrender. But of course, Zelensky did not want that to happen, and these people are fanatics, so that's just what's going to happen. They're going to fight to the death, pointlessly. And Mariupol. And the Russians decide to send them a warning because the other day, the Russians sent 2 Tupolev Tu-90 bombers with concrete buster bombs to attack this Azov-style steelworks because it's reported that this place has a bunch of underground tunnels. I'm not sure how many and how well fortified they are, but that's pretty believable. That's typical paver these guys would put. I'm pretty sure. So that's what's happening in Mariupol.
Just a quick correction here, America and Populist. That's actually the Tu-22 backfire, which is the one that was cited. That's Russia's long-range strategic bomber. So just a quick correction on the nomenclature there.
Yeah, Tu-22 bomber. Either way, the same thing. They use concrete buster bombs, which the Russians haven't used in a long time on this place. So they're not messing around with this garrison anymore. And once Mariupol is completely in Russian hands, which it pretty much is at this point, just cleanup operations, those forces can be used for the actual offensive to encircle the troops in the East Donbass region, in the Kharkov, Zaporozhye Oblast area, which is the main target of the Russian offensive, and the reason why they repositioned those forces we talked about earlier to focus on this area. And you have to keep in mind those forces not exactly in the best condition, as Russia took out the 3 major oil refineries, and they are all destroyed now. So they have no way to supply those troops with oil and gas.
This is definitely going to take a significant toll on the Ukrainian military, but
yeah, it's going to sap their morale once Mariupol falls, I think.
Yeah, but I do wonder what Russia's going to do. Like once they secure Donbass, like I wonder as to whether they'll like continue or if they'll just bring Ukraine to the negotiation table.
I think they're gonna do like a Operation Bagration style kind of mass offensive. I think they're gonna either adjust or drop their ROEs. If they're readying their strategic bombing forces, they're getting ready to drop all their ROEs. Like this is a point I made on the stream I did with Mandrill, I think, was there's no way that Russia does not have some of the strictest front-wide ROEs I've seen in any modern war, with the amount of civilian casualties or lack thereof that has occurred, inflicted by Russian forces. it is my legitimate belief that the majority of civilian casualties and war crimes are either complete falsifications or were committed by Ukrainian troops as false flags. I'm not saying Russians did nothing wrong, but the scale to which is being said they did is just not the case. These are all lies and overblown things by Western media. At the same time, I think with this concentration of armored forces in this, I don't know. I heard something about continued troop movements across the bridge to Crimea. I'm not sure if that's been verified, but if that is the case, I really do believe that Russia is going to prelude any sort of negotiation they tried to make with as soon as they take Mariupol, just a massive front wide push led by strategic bombing up until at least the Dnieper. And once they decide to put on their big boy pants and stop playing around with this failed Anschluss, right? I predicted in one of my articles that this would be an Anschluss, and I was completely proven wrong. And I can take that as I was proven wrong. That being said, this is, as soon as Russia drops these ROEs and decides to actually conduct a conventional war instead of whatever the fuck they were trying to do over the past month, I think this will end rather quickly.
Yeah, I hasten to agree. If they move in their strategic bombers, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I really kind of hope that they do what you're saying, Paul. I'm not 100% certain that they will, but I think they do have the assets to begin prosecuting the war as it should have been done in the first place, with an encirclement operation and just pounding the absolute living crap out of the Ukrainians with any sort of heavy assets. I mean, the whole plan in the first couple of weeks to just throw in your mechanized infantry piecemeal, I mean, it looks good on the map, right? Because you're taking terrain relatively quickly, but obviously that is a problem because you didn't secure it, and that played out in the footage.
Yeah, as we saw, these convoys were opened up to a lot of ambushes, which is why we saw a bunch of destroyed Russian supply trucks and tanks during the first few weeks of this operation, which was a bad decision.
So I do. Sorry, I do have one thing I'll address with Cringewalker's comment here. So he says that they sunk quite a few hundreds of millions into it to save it. Upgrades cost $700 million to keep it afloat until 2040. Oof, to 2040. I mean, this thing's already 50 years old. They want to have a warship that's, been 70 years old in service. I mean, that sounds like it was a bad decision to keep it afloat in the first place. I mean, the missiles on it are very, very good. Even the old Soviet missiles are quite capable. The SSN-12, which is what it was originally designed with. So it's just interesting, Cringewalker. I will say that your point about, again, to that old equals bad. Yes, generally speaking, there are exceptions to that, right? You're not going to redesign a new ship's hull unless there's like significant improvements. You're not going to redesign an anchor unless there's significant improvements. Like some things just do not change. Also, I mean, old technology or old style technology, like the whirligig style air search radar is good because it's or at least it should be good if you use it correctly in a context, right? How much of modern warfare is going to be how you're going to take what is a cheap asset and turning it into something that's much more capable, right? So if you design things to cost, like the old Oliver Hazard Perry class was designed to cost, if you make a modern version of that, I think you'll see a lot more of that in the future.
Definitely, and after the sinking of the Moskva, the Russians decided to warn the Ukrainians by saying that they were going to target decision-making centers, strategic military decision-making centers, including the ones in Kiev, which is kind of mind-boggling why you wouldn't attack strategic military centers on the first day of the war. Kind of mind-boggling there, but there was some confusion on whether that meant politicians or strategic military centers, so we still don't know what that actually means.
Like I said, I think it's just a case of Russia wanting to have their cake and eat it too, right? Russia expected, they didn't. I think they discounted the effect of Western propaganda on the minds of your average Eastern Ukrainian, but Russia just expected to be welcomed with open arms everywhere, and or and you can see how quickly of the decision to launch this invasion was, with how generally poorly executed it was. So yeah, you're completely right. They should have been hitting these places from day one, but they're kind of tottering off of, oh well, what if the West intervenes if we start doing it? Well, the West has basically fucking intervened in every possible way it could.
Yeah, short of actual conflict, right?
Yeah, short of actual conflict. So the minute Russia kind of realizes that, well, the West isn't willing to actually intervene in the way that matters, right? They're just dumping all their equipment and move to seize it, and barring some sort of egregious like bombing of Poland or something on accident. Like I think that the second they start bombing Kiev and other places like that, this will end, right? Looking at the 6 outcomes that we have here, I mean, I still think that the top 3. I don't think that they're going to take half of Ukraine. Honestly, I think that all they really got in them is to take Novorossiya. But shit, what do any of us fucking know?
Yeah.
Putin could pull out tomorrow.
I don't think that it'll just be a pullout scenario. I see like any possible outcome is going to be determined on the successful destruction of the Ukrainian army in the east. So like for Putin now, any sort of like peace settlement, either whether it's declared or not declared, or whether he tries to get this sort of like Pyrrhic Russian victory that you see in the middle of the screen there, like he's going to have to defeat the Ukrainian army in the field, right? That's the main thing, because if he does that, I mean, then he can take the east and maybe Odessa, depending on how long he wants to keep going at this. I honestly think at this point he's committed enough resources. I still think he should take the east. Honestly, it's not in his stated strategic goals, as Charlemagne pointed out, but like he should just do it.
In my opinion, I do think a landlock scenario is right. Now, it could be wrong about that, but for the landlock scenario, it would make sense on his part since it would basically give him complete access to the Black Sea, and it would also allow for him to connect Transnistria through the south of Ukraine, which is why I do think it is possible he could go for that outcome. But I could be wrong, though, but I guess we'll have to see.
Well, it depends on how far he's willing to go because Putin is very weird in his decision making on the way he prosecuted this war. And the main reason why he didn't decide just to go full shock and awe like the U.S. does in every single time it engages in war with bombings and artillery strikes to level cities is because he wanted to preserve the buildings and the infrastructure for once the territory was liberated by Russian troops, which he thought would be easy. And that proved to be wrong. He missed some key assumptions there. So that was his main mistake in the first outcome of the war. So I think he's kind of abandoning that, and some of his advisors around him are kind of persuading him that the outcome is not likely. And it's just at this point, just go full force and just get it done at this point.
Yeah, since he's basically dragged it for like over a month now.
And he has to pull out a victory because, again, many people will point out how he has an 82% approval rating, but that's contingent on victory.
Yes.
Again, he has to be victorious in this outcome.
Yes, and he will find the men to commit to this to win. Like, he will. I think, remember American Populist, there was some like talk on Twitter about the conscription, and Russia was supposedly conscripting in their annual take of 135,000 men. I don't know exactly how that compares to what they normally take, but that seems pretty significant. And I thought, like, okay, so if they conscript extra people, they could send these people to Eastern Siberia or wherever area that they don't need to defend right now. And while they're there, you get them trained up, get them, military ready, whatever. But all of the actual combat ready troops that are organized and ready to go in active service, you can basically just do a switch move and send those guys to Ukraine.
Definitely, I think that's what those troops are going to be used for.
Yeah.
Because
in
in my opinion, I think the landlocked scenario is likely in a minimum, but also Novorossiya is like the bare minimum for victory that he must have. Because again, losing this war would be at the end for Putin. It would be. It would be a humiliation, and the oligarchs, who again have power, would not like that because they have lost money in this conflict. We can't forget that. Even if they are loyal to him, money still matters to them.
And Pop, if you'll allow me to kind of push back on that, I don't actually think the oligarchs are relevant at all with Russian politics. I think they're actually impotent. I think they were relevant maybe 20 years ago, but I don't believe that Putin's power is built on the oligarchs. I think Putin's power is built on the things that every Russian autocrat's power has been built on for the past couple hundred years, which is the military, the Russian Orthodox Church, and the intelligence community of Russia. And I think Putin still has all three of those things. So I understand the point that the oligarchs make, but I don't think that they have the impact or the influence that they did in the 90s when they were basically given carte blanche by the West to kind of put in Yeltsin. Russia, I think, is very much the politics of blood over the politics of money, and Putin has people that will kill for him. Now, speaking to Putin personally, I think he wants to retire. I think he's done. I think he wants to get out of office. He's in his 70s, if I'm not wrong. He's rich. He just wants to live out his golden years. But the Russian people, I don't think, will not let him leave. However this ends, I think this will be his kind of the crowning thing of his career.
Yeah. So he basically wants to end it off with like taking control over most of Ukraine, basically.
Yeah. Essentially.
That he has to protect the Russian-speaking minority. He can't abandon them. Because then
he can go down to Russian history as the one who basically liberated Ukraine, as that's how they'll portray him as.
Yeah, and you have to remember, Russian politics is a lot more brutal than the West. I think Binary Surfer on one of Academic Agent streams was talking about how, this is the kind of politics where you don't just go to your dacha out in the forest, right? You go there to die, basically. You don't retire.
Yeah, and he's been in power for a long time, so he's not just gonna leave office.
If my character read on him is right, and I could be wrong with this, but if my character read on him is correct, he wants to pass this off to his successor. He wants to pass this off to someone else. Like y'all have said, he's been in power since like the frickin' 90s. When did he come in first? Was it the 90s or was it like right at the turn of the millennium?
I think 2000.
Prime Minister.
Regardless, it's been 2 decades.
Yeah.
He's not a spring chicken. He's in his 70s. He does want to go to his dacha to die, basically. Like he's done with the whole thing.
Yeah.
And I think if he wins in Ukraine, that's actually a good enough excuse to say, hey, look, I've given you this, let me out.
Yeah.
I guess he also has to choose a successor that'll basically continue on his legacy, I guess.
Yeah. His blessing is going to be crucial in choosing whoever rules Russia next. He did have that period where he wasn't actually technically in power because Medvedev had the actual technical reins, but he was still the president, if not or the prime minister instead of the president of Russia. So it's like, okay, you're still in a position of authority, basically. So he's been around for so long. Yeah, I would agree with that assessment.
I think that period was kind of testing out to see if Medvedev could actually take his place. I don't like the characterization of how it was just like, oh, he was still controlling the government from outside. No, I think it was actually him giving like Medvedev a test run to see if he could do the same thing, and that's why. And I think that he stepped back in because Medvedev kind of proved he couldn't. Yeah, that's another thing working against Putin is that, especially my guys who know Russian politics, there's no real successor that's clear that could step in. What would be funny though is if Belarus got annexed and Lukashenko just became president of the Belarusia Russia Federation or something. That's a funny little schizo timeline. But
finally becomes a colonel.
Yeah,
he gets his dream finally.
And
Oh,
then
that is kind of
Europe
funny
become
because
friendly.
Russia and Belarus have signed a pact. I think it was in the 90s that they were going to work towards becoming one country, unified. I'm not sure if they're still working towards that goal, though. It seems like Putin's being pretty successful in that regard. Belarus is Russia's puppet state.
Yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
technically, you could say they're unified in a sense, since Belarus basically does what Russia tells it to.
Yeah, it's. I mean, there are limits to that, right? But it's basically de facto, but not de jure at this point, or closer to that than not. And frankly, I think the situation with the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics are going to be a similar deal if they're not already. So I think eventually, once it won't cost Russia to do so, they'll annex those territories.
And the West will cry and screech once again once that happens, but they can't really do anything about it. So my thoughts on this is just that we're just seeing the repositioning mainly of the forces, and yes, Russia suffered some losses, of course, this war again, but these are just strategic repositioning for the main goal and the main offensive, which is going to kick off very, very soon. If they're already deploying strategic bombers to take out the Azov Steelworks and shelling it, that tells me that they're getting ready to clear this operation and get ready to go. So I think we're about to see real action very, very soon instead of this just crawl of nothingness, basically, until we got news about the Moskva, which is the most interesting thing that happened in weeks.
Yeah, we'll see. We shall see.
Indeed, we shall see.
Yep.
So that's my current position on what's going on with this war. So I'll open up, I'll let you guys give your thoughts on what's likely to happen, where we're going with this conflict, and what the West is going to do.
Well, in my opinion, I mean, I think Russia's just gonna, as of right now, focus on securing the Donbass region. And then maybe afterwards they'll probably like focus on the south or something. As in regards to the West, I don't think the West is really going to do much except virtue signal and place sanctions. But in the end, I do think Russia will effectively get what it wants, and I do think they're going to try to also end this conflict sooner, since it's already been going for almost 2 months now. So that's just my take on it.
Yeah, I've already kind of given my take here, which is that any sort of peace settlement or anything like that is going to have to be contingent on the defeat of the Ukrainian army in the field, at bare minimum. And because if you do that, then you can basically just say, "Oh, I won," even if the Zelensky regime isn't willing to admit surrender. But yeah, I personally think Putin should be much more willing to take terrain in the east than he has laid out in his strategic documents and stuff. I think he probably should do that at this point if he has the strength.
Yeah, if he also has the will to do it too. It depends on what he wants to do at this point and what victory in his mind means, how far we're going with territory. That was standing. Let's get to questions before we close out this chat. We have some good questions here. So Odessa is too mine to be taken. That's why they never bothered to invade south. It would be a total slaughter when the Ukrainian military stays away to blowing up their own. I'm not sure about the mines in Odessa. I've been doing a lot of research into that, but they can just go through land. They already have a land bridge from Crimea, so I'm not sure if how much that prevents them from.
But at the same time, that whole geographical region, unless I'm completely mistaken, and if I am, someone correct me, but I think that whole part of the coast is swamps, or at least very marshy, which would slow down any sort of land invasion along the coastline, and so that would force any sort of invasion by Russian forces to occur further inland, to besiege the city from the north, or in a really, really crazy scenario, to push up with the security force from Transnistria, which I don't think will happen. But no, I think that's a valid point Cringe Walker makes. At the same time, Odessa isn't as strategically relevant because of the fact that Russia has absolute naval superiority in the Black Sea. Odessa is not really being used for much.
Yeah, the Russians can prevent the Ukrainians from using Odessa at any time. I mean, it is important to for the landlocked scenario anyway, to ensure that Ukraine has no capacity to use a major, deep water port at all. But if they have one, it really doesn't matter if they have naval supremacy there, because they can just shut them off at any time that they would like, and blockade them. The other thing that I would like to touch on is that's an interesting point that you bring up, Paul, about the marshy ground. I have been wondering recently why the Russians were so hesitant to commit their. They had, I guess, like a battalion of like 800 naval infantrymen or something that they were holding in reserve or something on their amphibious landing ships that we spoke about in our previous streams. At least that was what seemed to be floating around Twitter. And if they hadn't already like deployed them in the Crimea region, I was curious as to why they were just keeping them aboard ship or holding them back for whatever reason. And because I was just simply very curious as to why they didn't attempt to surround Mykolaiv from the sea side, basically, because they had a whole bunch of forces on the east and to the north. And I was like thinking to myself, okay, why don't they just attack from the seaside with these naval infantry forces and take it? But if it's marshy ground all in that region, that might explain why they might have been uncomfortable to do so for whatever reason of they didn't want to risk their landing craft, or they didn't think it was a good idea, or it was too just too boggy.
And that could be the main reason where they're just waiting for this offensive in the east to be successful before they consider any more territorial acquisitions. That could be the reason as well, because they do still have those landing ships in Crimea. They haven't moved, as far as I know.
Yeah, I think that's primarily because of the combination of the potential of mines there, which would, I think, chew up any sort of naval invasion, plus the fact that I don't know if they're capable of deploying heavy support assets to those Marines anywhere they do land them, and combine that with the terrible marshy terrain. Really, naval invasions are very limited. This is why the idea of Marine Corps have sort of been de-emphasized since the Second World Wars, because naval invasions are only really possible and feasible and do anything in very specific strategic circumstances where you can very quickly support that beachhead by landing basically regular army assets or more heavy ground support in the form of armor, in the form of artillery, in the form of air superiority and the like. And you can turn that beachhead into another front, right? And in this case, the theater is so limited that anything Russia gains from opening up another front is mitigated, number one, by the amount of resources it would take for them to do that, and number two, the amount of losses that they would take. And number three, the very minimal amount of advantage they would get from opening that up. So really, I just think they're keeping them in reserve just to have another light infantry line unit, because at the end of the day, that's pretty much what the Marines mostly get used for, is just another light infantry line unit.
Right.
That's kind of my take on the whole thing.
Right. I mean, my whole thing was just to use the Marine. If I was, in charge of the Russians, I would have, and I actually wanted to take Mykolaiv, I would have, considered launching them from the sea, because if you've already got forces in the area that could ostensibly reach those Marines if they got to the outskirts of Mykolaiv, that would be a way to do that. And, you could easily resupply them, not just from the sea, but also from the land. And that's basically how I would use them. But anyway.
Yeah, I would say, just to cap up what the others have said in this panel, Mykolaiv is a more important target than Odessa is anyway, because it's a major shipbuilding yard. It was the biggest in the Soviet Union, I believe. It's where the Moskva was built, actually, was in Mykolaiv. So the Russians are pretty close to that position, actually, from their Heads in Kherson region area. So that could be part of their goal as well. It's more strategically valuable anyway than just some historical city.
It wouldn't be hard for them to take it if they really wanted to, but they got to finish the Ukrainian army in the east first. So
exactly, just not a priority at the moment. And so that's what the current situation is in the Ukraine war right now. we're about to see some major updates hopefully very soon, and hopefully this war will be over so we can stop talking about it. That's what I'm looking forward to most, because there's more interesting things to talk about in life. In Ukraine for 5 years straight.
It's not even a fun war. The Donbass war was more fun than this war.
Yeah, much more interesting flags, much more interesting combat. I will say.
Yeah.
Instead of this just boring combat, which we don't have at the moment.
But I guess
It's boring. It's boring because every Western news outlet is out to make it into like it's this big thing. Like,
And when it's not, it's
yeah,
just like it's such a letdown when it's not actually World War III. You know,
no. Well,
they
and
just
you
want
know,
to hype it up.
yeah, exactly. But you know, Donbass was started off like the whole like Donbass conflict was kicked off by some like reenactor and 80 guys just taking over a city of like 30,000. Like that's cool as shit. And they held it for I think like 6 months.
Yeah, that's
They
pretty.
also held
Yeah.
Kharkov briefly for a period of time as well.
Yeah. Yeah, it's just that back then they thought that Putin was gonna go west to help them out immediately, but they did not. I don't know. I mean, I think the whole thing is just like is gonna. People say that history is back on. I don't really think so. I mean, I think this is like one of the last gasps of the Francis Fukuyama end of history zeitgeist, where even this war, even this conventional war, feels freaking meaningless because it's just not going anywhere, right? It feels like it's another like Iraq/Afghanistan with you know how much it's just everyone involved who's not Russia is just interested in prolonging it for as long as possible. So, you know, to avoid going on a rant, that's kind of where I'm going to cut myself off.
Yeah. You just like
Yeah.
drag it out for no reason, basically.
Yeah.
well, hopefully Russia will get the wheels moving again, and they'll actually finish up the business that they set out to do in the first place. But anyway.
Hopefully they will. I would agree to static at the moment, which is very boring, especially for the maps. When we're getting maps, which is what everybody on Twitter wants secretly.
Yeah.
But
Yeah, Map Twitter goes crazy for those ISW maps, man.
right, that's what everybody's looking forward to, a brand new one coming out. But anyway, at the moment, not very interesting, but some interesting updates. So that's why I updated you guys. And so with that, I will be closing out the stream. Any closing thoughts, you guys? Anything you want to show before we go?
Yeah.
I'll start by shilling.
No, go ahead, Mental.
Yeah. So, make sure you guys follow me on Twitter. I'm on Gab. I'm in Telegram. I have a Substack account, which I have some works in progress on both my Substack and in my YouTube account. So stay tuned for that stuff.
Yeah. In addition, you know, same everything that Mandel has, I also have. I'm on Twitter at CavKingPaul. You can find me on Telegram at Paul_Fahrenheit. But the big thing that I wanna shill tonight is at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. I will be dropping episode 1 of my paid podcast. My guest will be Thomas777. And we discuss Chicago and Chicagoland and its place in the American history, consciousness, and future. This episode is entirely based around Americana, and there are tons of guests lined up from the Sphere and from other places. And we will talk about various parts of Virginia, of the United States, of all the other states. And I hope it's going to be worth the price that people will pay for it.
Yeah. And for me, I'm on YouTube most of the time. I also have Twitter, which I'm going to be posting on more, so you can find me on those. You can also find me on Telegram. My Telegram is Noble Crusader. And yeah, so if you're interested in any geopolitical news, just be sure to check out my channel because I frequently post on there.
If you haven't already, subscribe to my channel. What are you doing? Be based. Subscribe to my channel. I cover lots of these geopolitical situations on these update streams. Also, history, philosophy, politics of the U.S. and the U.S. empire as it currently stands in the modern era. So if you do enjoy that content, please like and subscribe, as I do greatly appreciate it. And do check out my wonderful guest links. They are in the description. And have an excellent Easter and have an excellent day.